this is one of the toughest job markets for, especially for young people. You're looking at the youth unemployment stats, which are double the national average here in Canada, and we see some of this across the world. And I do worry about an entire generation that if they don't have a pathway into the future workforce and future economy, a ladder into it, they're going to be left behind in terms of the confidence, the momentum, the critical thinking judgment, and meaningful work. I think in some ways we're going to see a career sort of progression for this generation, in particular, that's no longer just a linear, graduate, apply, and climb the corporate ladder, much more of a what I call a jungle gym, and where you're sort of exploring, that you're building things and adapting and pivoting, being a CEO of your own career. And that could mean starting from scratch. It could mean joining something. It could mean buying an existing business.
When we talk about digital divides, I worry that the gap between people using it as an answer engine versus using it to help provide you with better thinking, that's going to be the problem.
We need to understand always what the funding model is and what is the political system behind any tool that our kids are using.
AI is not some machine god somewhere up in the sky. It's a physical building on someone else's land, drinking up someone's water.
You can make a robot to sort of be anthropomorphically credible. People, when they have a conversation with it, they think there's a human mind behind it.
What if virtual reality can be our training platform where we can interact with others without actually hurting them?
And we're now at this next sort of inflection point where perhaps the systems that we're trying to produce are going to take over the decision to commission violence in the first place.
It's not a technology problem, it's a leadership problem right now.
It's one thing to overcome death for human beings, but we're dealing with an age of AI where maybe it won't even be human beings that conquer death. It'll be sort of like AI that takes over the world.
What kind of society do we want AI to help us build? Because if we don't answer that intentionally, these other forces are going to answer it for us.
Welcome to a new season of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season, we're exploring empathy in the era of AI.
Together with my expert guests, we dive into armed conflict, ed tech, neocolonialism, transhumanism, online abuse, the future of work, and so much more.
You don't want to miss a single episode, so hit that subscribe button now. And if you like what you hear, post a comment and share the show.
Hi. With so much noise about AI right now, I think it's hard to make sense of things. The warnings and the predictions and the promises. Look, I've spent the past 15 years studying empathy, and what I'm really concerned about is how will AI impact how we treat one another? So I decided to sit down and speak with a variety of experts, and the result is this 25-part series exploring how artificial intelligence will reshape our relationships and our society. Turns out there's a ton at stake, so I do hope you'll join me on this learning journey. Today, my guest is Steven Wang, CEO of Venture for Canada. He's also the former editor-in-chief of the Harvard International Law Journal, and he's a passionate advocate for responsible AI, entrepreneurship, and the future of work. In this conversation, we explore how AI is disrupting business, entrepreneurship, and innovation, why it's important to equip the next generation with entrepreneurial skills and mindsets, especially as they enter an entirely different job market, why human skills like empathy and judgment are becoming more important as AI transforms the workforce, what responsible AI should look like at a time of unprecedented technological, economic, and societal change, and finally, what citizens should be demanding from their policymakers. So look, if you want to understand how AI is reshaping work and what's important to think about on behalf of the next generation, this show is for you.
Welcome to the show, Steven.
Thank you, Nita. Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. I'm very excited about all that we're going to unpack. I think we're going to start at a high level and then get kind of serious about the impact of AI on businesses and the entrepreneurial kind of ecosystem, especially in Canada, because I know that's where you're working. But first, I'd love for listeners and viewers to get to know you a little bit more. I mean, I'll just, headline, David Rockefeller Fellow, Rhodes Scholar, editor-in-chief of the Harvard International Journal, lectured Harvard Law School, University of Toronto, and now CEO of Venture for Canada. It's like, wow, right? But there's always so much more to somebody than a work bio. So I'd love to know a little bit about you and sort of what makes you passionate about what you're up to these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share a bit. I think sometimes I describe my own journey as one that's shaped by crossing different worlds or different systems. I moved to Canada with my family when I was 9 years old. And, like many immigrants here, I arrived trying to, make sense of this new environment, new country, new culture, and institutions. And then I think that experience inherently made me very curious early on about both this country and just the world at large, how it works and who gets access to opportunity within them. And then that sort of led me to different experiences, in law, global affairs, in China, and education, entrepreneurship. So, as you mentioned, I practiced for a number of years in New York and Toronto, taught at a few universities, and earlier previously built a nonprofit in Asia. And I think what ties all of this together is kind of the question of how do institutions and systems expand human potential, and so that's what drew me to law, policy, and AI as well now, because in some ways it's not just another technology, but a force that will reshape opportunity, work, knowledge, and power. And so I think this is a moment that requires, especially folks, like yourself, Nita, and many others, and who've appeared on this podcast, who can bridge sectors, across technology, policy, education, business, and still keep the human dimension at the center. So that's, I think I would probably capture some of my journey so far in explorations.
Well, I love that Canada now has you. But you can
Thank you.
you can cross many dimensions, right? Of the working life and culture of what it means to be sort of a polyglot citizen of the world. Um,
Yeah.
I am excited to have this conversation because with everyone that I'm chatting with about AI, I'm learning how to think about the future a little differently. And I
Mhm.
think it's really just important that people start paying attention to, we're like in the middle of a transition, like we're in maybe in the earliest stages of it, but like we have also something to say about how things evolve. I think we really need to
Yes.
lean into that. So I know that you taught this course at the University of Toronto called AI
Yeah.
Governance and Democracy, which is like very,
Yeah.
very big.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start this conversation at a high level and talk about, so what do you think citizens, society at
Mhm.
large, should be thinking
Yeah.
about, and maybe even really kind of like pressing our policymakers to do? Like, I just really want to understand your
Yeah.
thoughts on like how should we be participating in this moment?
Absolutely. Well, I think, as you say, Nina, that just the starting point is that you're right. I think a lot of people do feel like AI is happening to us and rather than by us. And how do we kind of take back a bit of that sense of agency? Is critical piece of this story. Um, I think part of it is, kind of challenging this conception that AI is primarily about just the technology, and then in fact, so much of it is also about governance. At U of T at this course, one of the things we explored is, some of these non-technical questions like who governs AI, who benefits from it, who bears the risks, and who's accountable when things go wrong. And these are the things that I think citizens should be demanding. In particular, for example, I think three areas we could think about. One is around transparency. If AI is influencing hiring, lending, education, healthcare, public services, people should know, you know, in what ways, how, what are the processes, what are the decisions making processes. Second is accountability, that institutions and cannot be outsourcing these responsibilities to just algorithms or just to private companies. And the third, I think, is around inclusion. I think that citizens should be actively thinking about and helping to shape AI policy that's not just for this small technocratic capital elites per se, and that because they are affecting everyone. So it is a deeper, I think, democratic exercise of thinking about, in some ways, what kind of society do we want AI to help us build? Because if we don't answer that intentionally, in some ways, these other forces are going to answer it for us. And so I really do believe, as you alluded to, the future AI doesn't and shouldn't be decided solely by, engineers or the market and it must be shaped democratically by citizens.
So, I mean, the fact that democracy was in the title of the course, and that we're really kind of coming to grips with the fact that social media has actually been a drag on democracy because so many foreign influences could come in and just abuse of the algorithms to radicalize people and to polarize people. And I wonder what in that course stays with you as a conversation you had with students or a case study that you looked at that kind of keeps you up at night. Like when you think about democracy, because I think democracy is worth saving, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um, I think first of all, it really does make us think about like what democracy really means to different people and how does it relate to our daily experiences and how do we want to conceive of our democracy going forward. And so it does present an interesting opportunity because in some ways democracy, some people say you get the democracy you deserve. So, to what extent are we having an engaged citizenry? Are they informed? And are they so easily then with, how AI in some ways magnifies both the best and worst of human instincts? And do we have, robust institutions that can withstand some of these polls at extreme ends? And how do we, redesign maybe even certain democratic institutions that there are more voices, participation, but then you're also dealing with challenges like the speed of technology is moving, AI moving so quickly, but institutions are evolving much more slowly. And so, how do E.O. Wilson has this great quote. It says, "We have primordial brains, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." Right. And so they're like completely in different sync. And and I do also think that the role of leadership is important because how do we guide a citizenry towards that process because it is so disorienting, I think, and overwhelming. And along with that, the technological, geopolitical changes in the world right now, it can feel that sense of just like, how do I find a sense of a security, a stable base from which to then you can explore. And so there are a lot of fundamental questions around the social contract that we have with one another and we have with government, we have across generations that will need to be re-examined. And part of it is just really having deliberate conversations and at all levels of society.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing as a through line in all of that is that we need to become informed in order to be actors with agency, but like the time is now.
Yes. We need to get ahead.
Get ahead, right. Which is
Yeah.
why I've heard you say that I've read in something that you've written that we're sort of at a critical inflection point, the climate crisis, geopolitical uncertainty, economic transformation, technological transformation. So some have argued that while the economic and technical prerequisites for civilizational flourishing still exist, okay, so good news, the political, institutional, philosophical prerequisites do not, which is sort of what you were hinting at just before in your answer. So here is the opportunity for responsible AI to play a role, right? So I've heard responsible AI. I think you're a proponent. I just wonder, like, what does it mean? Why is that
Right.
important at this point in human history to have responsible AI?
Right. Yeah, I mean, and there's lots of different perhaps conceptions of it. For me, it's very simple in a sense of that, this is a technology that can have a lot of positive benefits, but needs to be adopted in a way that ensures some of the risks are mitigated as well. So it's really balancing those two. And, so that means I think building and deploying AI in ways that are aligned with, human values, that are accountable. In society and democracies, and conscious of the longer term downstream consequences. So that sounds, a bit abstract, but I think it's also very practical, right? So it means, for example, asking before a deployment by a company or lab, not just can we build this, but should we? And not just will it scale, but, you know, what does it scale and enable? And as you alluded to, this moment in history, that I think that matters because now we have these multiple crises that are converging: the climate stress, the geopolitical instability, democratic fragility, and economic inequality. So AI is entering into that environment sort of as a multiplier, right? Exactly. And so it can multiply some good things like, certainly productivity, creativity, scientific progress, if done right, but also could multiply the biases, the concentrations of power, misinformation, inequality. So I think responsible AI then is about deciding thoughtfully what we want to be amplified and how does we ensure that that is actually carried out through the different institutions, policies, and various incentives we have in the world. And I think that will be one of the defining questions of our time. And so, I really see AI as not, again, a destiny. It's really a part of that governance, these set of, concrete decisions that we have to make deliberately that's going to decide, hopefully together, that's going to benefit everyone.
That's right. Again, so it plays back. I mean, what I keep feeling over and over is like engagement is key, participation is key. Okay, so let's funnel down a little bit into sort of the future of work, okay? Because I think that's where we're going here. There's no question that AI is already disrupting the global workforce, and some people
Yeah.
are terrified and others are optimistic. And I recently came across this research study that kind of made me feel like, oh, okay, that won't be so bad, because I know there's this debate that we're all going to be on not so much unemployment, but like getting like UBI stipends, and where's that going to come from if nobody's actually working, and who's got the power? And it's kind of really trippy when you think about how much disruption could happen in such a short period of time, and I don't know if society is ready for it, right? But then
Right.
I read this research study, and I'm going to include it in the show notes, that
Mm.
while 85 million jobs will be displaced in 2025, that was like a
Wow.
study that came out
Yeah.
last year, 97 million new roles will simultaneously emerge, representing a net positive of 12 million positions globally. So you're like, oh, okay, that's not so bad. So let's talk about you and your new role. It's fairly new, right? It's I think a year now. You're CEO of Venture for Canada, a national nonprofit with a mission to transform how Canadians access meaningful work through proven entrepreneurial pathways and programs. Okay, so
Mm.
share a little bit more if that statement about what Venture for Canada is about is insufficient. But like, why is that important? Why do we all need to develop
Yeah.
an entrepreneurial mindset?
Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you, Anita. And those are very interesting stats you referred to. And yeah, I think it is a question that so many people are asking, both in the short term and long term. And I think that might be part of the short term. I mean, just the very current moment, but then even in 2 years and 3 years, it could look quite different, or 5 years. So in some ways, nobody fully knows the answers, but we know for sure it's going to disrupt the labor force in various ways. And partly what drew me to this role is that already we're seeing not just AI, but there was a Harvard Business Review article that was talking about sort of the anticipatory impact for certain businesses that are closing entry level roles. They say 1 in 5 because of AI, but it's not necessarily it's the AI itself, but it's the anticipatory impact it might have, or they're using it as a guise to, they're being more risk averse and just kind of hiring less. So whatever the reasons are, we know from just what we're hearing on the ground is this is one of the toughest job markets for, especially for young people. You're looking at the youth unemployment stats, which are double the national average here in Canada, and we see some of this across the world. And I do worry about an entire generation that if they don't have a pathway into the future workforce and future economy, a ladder into it, they're going to be left behind in terms of the confidence, the momentum, the critical thinking judgment, and meaningful work, right? And I don't think it's just going to be, at least in the near future, where like, oh, we have some social policy that's like everybody's just having fun, and not doing anything because people do still want do something meaningful. And so I talk about this experience gap because it's a chicken and egg or a catch 22. To get a job, you need experience. To get experience, you need a job. But people now entry level roles are sometimes saying you need 2 to 3 years, just to get hired. And so with AI, I think it could certainly magnify the potential disruptions and across all age ranges, right? And here I'm just talking about the youth for a moment. And so the question in my mind then is to think about how to turn this AI from a threat into a potential opportunity, given the fact that, young people are more AI native, they're able to use it more, but we need to guide them to use it in the right way. So it's still using the critical judgment, thinking, still human center, like empathy. Um, and, the entrepreneurial piece comes in where I think in some ways we're going to see a career sort of progression for this generation, in particular, that's no longer just a linear, graduate, apply, and climb the corporate ladder, much more of a what I call a jungle gym, and where you're sort of exploring, then you're building things and adapting and pivoting. And so you have, by definition, have to be able to entrepreneur with your mindset of how you approach your career. And I say talk about being a CEO of your own career. And that could mean starting from scratch. It could mean joining something. It could mean buying an existing business. Here in Canada, we have 3/4 of family-owned businesses who are going to retire, and who's going to take over, and ensuring that responsible intergeneration transfer ownership and keeping it local communities. And so there's so many new pathways that needs to be created. That's not going to be the traditional as certain opportunities are closed to them. So, but that's going to be very much in the weeds of like trying things out, right? It's like you can't just like think up some beautiful idea but it's gonna. So that's partly how I see our role at Venture Canada is to be a national engine, to be piloting new pathways, scaling those, and then creating more proof and platforms so we can inform policymaking as well. And I think essentially it will be a combination, as I mentioned, the entrepreneurial mindset, the AI literacy in the specific business, applied context, and then some concrete skills, whether it's like sales, marketing, other things, and marrying these different pieces so that you're equipping them to navigate what's ahead. Because it's no longer just about credentials, right? It's really about that adaptability, and we hopefully can help accompany this generation to navigate some of those changes, because it can feel very disorienting, and it can take out some of the hope that people have about the future.
So when I talk about entrepreneurial skills, I believe it's not just about starting a business, for example. It's really, I think, in some ways, the ability to create value under conditions of uncertainty, including how you're going to get the resources to achieve that. And so to me, that involves a few core components. One is the problem finding. Can you really identify this unmet need that's real? Second, taking that initiative, right? Like being able to move without having the perfect context and guidance instructions. Third, I think it's really that resourcefulness, like being able to do something with just limited time, energy, money, resources. And then I think fourth is that resilience, just being able to really deal with all the constant rejection and ambiguity, setbacks without collapsing. So I think those are probably the core things that, in that entrepreneurial mindset and skills. And so and maybe the last thing I'll add too is that communication piece is then can you bring other people along with you? So I think our experience with Venture Canada is less about acquiring this sitting in the classroom and really doing it, getting that hands-on experience. And that could mean launching a small project, organizing, helping a small business think about how to use AI or building a prototype. And just taking initiative and responsibility when no one's asking for it. And I think that building that muscle is so important early on throughout the journey.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing sort of layers of agility and sort of intelligent risk taking, but also sort of, if you stumble, you get up and you brush yourself off and you keep going. I think those are really important skills in general to have. And I think about sort of the generation that I grew up with, parents would send you outside and say, like, see you at dinner time, and then there's been over time this gradual shift towards, protecting children. And, I teach at a university and I always find it interesting that parents come to Parent Week and are involved in like helping their own kids schedule their classes and sort of like their semester schedule. So I feel like these skills kind of speak to a moment where, kids who might have been protected a little bit might need to actually realize that this thing that they call failure, because they're a little bit risk averse, is actually not a bad thing. Like you got to test some things out in order to figure out that you're resilient enough in the face of adversity. So I think these are all really good skills for a whole generation coming up the ranks to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think you definitely notice that cultural difference in some ways between parts of our country and say Silicon Valley and other parts where, failure is very much sometimes even celebrated. It's like, oh, cool. What'd you learn? What are you doing next? Whereas here, I think because, for various reasons, I think we're a little bit more averse, as you say, to taking those risks and kind of hiding our failures. So
I'm really glad to hear that there's an entity pan-Canadian that's looking at the kinds of entrepreneurial skills and mindsets that are needed for this AI enabled innovation economy that we're moving into. I know that one of the programs that your organization has is called Entrepreneurship through Acquisition, which I find interesting because it's instead of starting from scratch, like the startup culture, it's Canadians taking over and modernizing existing businesses. I find that fascinating. So I'd love you to talk about that. But since you're already on the ground speaking to business owners and entrepreneurs and looking at ways to modernize, I guess, a lot through I want to know what you're hearing, what needs are being expressed, and what specific opportunities around that sort of transfer.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, around small businesses who, at least in Canada, for example, it is a significant majority. It's the bedrock of our economy here, and they are, I think, approaching this AI question with a mixture of curiosity and anxiety, overwhelm. So they know, it's gonna be here. It matters in some way. They're seeing, for example, maybe competitors experimenting with it. They hear the hype, lots of hype out there, but oftentimes they don't know where to begin. And so, when I talk to small business owners, they're not asking these big macro questions like, what's the future of AGI? Right? Like, what is super intelligence going to look like? They're asking me, can this help me save time, improve customer service, reduce admin, help me hire better? And so it's certainly more practical. But they're definitely facing a lot of constraints, right? They, not unlike this larger companies, you can engage a consulting firm, Deloitte or McKinsey, or one of the tech companies to help design solution implementation. They just don't have resources, the time, the trusted guidance, and also implementation capacity, right? So, and that's where I think also the opportunity is for talents to help small businesses with that responsible adoption process. So, and to do it in a way that is both can unlock productivity gains at scale, but also be mindful of managing those risks. Because I am hearing from, the small business owners about data privacy, governance, cybersecurity. So all those issues that we also need to be thinking that AI can present. And so I think in that sense, programs like the entrepreneurship acquisition that we're doing here at Venture Canada is exciting because I think now we can then, through that process, in some ways, we're education charity that's educating a whole generation that's going to maybe take on and help modernize these businesses and continue them thrive by adopting, for example, things like AI. But then we can start planting seeds with them now. It's like, okay, if you're thinking about that, here are some things that you can start thinking about. If your playbook is right about capturing a bigger value, not just for yourself, but for the country. Because my worry too, because I think the other extreme is, and I used to be a corporate lawyer, right? Like those private equity folks from Wall Street, just coming in, rolling up, buying everything, putting some sort of AI playbook, and then, lots of local jobs or and communities are negative impacted significantly. So it is about that intergenerational economic renewal. And which I think is also really, really important and responsibility for all of us.
All right, so you're leading this effort at a Canadian level. I wonder for any layperson out there who's listening to our conversation, what skills do you think that they should be developing? This idea of a basket of skills under entrepreneurial mindset sounds beautiful, but what practically does that mean? And what is your organization doing besides the program that we just talked about? Like, I'd love to
Yeah.
just understand it a bit better.
Absolutely. Well, I think throughout our organization's experience, as you said, even the term is entrepreneurial. In some ways, it's very much just the human skills, right? And I think that is all the more there's a premium on the human values and skills in an AI era, ironically, because as AI becomes more capable, our sort of unique advantage, right, is these human capabilities, and which I think, to name three, for example, one is judgment, right, like that acute sense of context and knowing what matters, and the second, adaptability, being able to navigate those changes and pivoting and working with others, and the third is that empathy, which you talk a lot about, Anita. And I think that understanding people and those across differences, and because so much human life is relational, and right, whether it's leadership, whether it's trust, whether it's teams or democracies. And so I do think that while AI can help with some of the optimization of certain things, it should not replace that moral understanding and lived human context. And so if we can embed, this empathy as a design principle throughout various AI upscaling and adoption initiatives for in education or small businesses, then I think organizations will start asking, much deeper set of questions, right? It's not, for example, businesses shouldn't just be asking, how do we reduce headcount in the most efficient manner, but really, how do we augment, workers' capabilities in a meaningful way? And instead of asking just like, how do we maximize, efficiency, we're thinking also about questions around dignity, how do we preserve dignity, and not just about automation, right? But also, how do we ensure that human connection that matter most are continuing to be nurtured? So I think it's a shift in how we, address these things, and these are things that all of us can play a role in actively thinking about what are those values we want to continue to nurture. Um, because I think in the end, efficiency can only just tell you how fast you move, but empathy really tells whether you're moving in the right direction. Right?
I love that. I love that. Coming from a former corporate lawyer, I absolutely
This is why I'm a former. Yeah.
No, but it's nice to hear, because if you're at like the epicenter of people thinking in Canada about how do we, have a robust and vibrant workforce, small businesses are the backbone of our economy, and the AI revolution is coming. Nonetheless, you're still talking about how important it is. So you mentioned three things. You said, okay, so empathy, okay, check mark on that, like you're speaking to the converted. The other two were adaptability, and the first one was
Judgment.
judgment. Judgment. I got to tell you a story. To circle back to a conversation I had with a woman who leads AI and innovation in Quebec. She told me, so her family is from Vietnam. Her mom was born in Vietnam, and she came over also as an immigrant, not unlike you. And she had a shop that did dry cleaning, and she was a seamstress. Okay. And it was a couple of times that she left her shop with cash. This was like many years ago when it was not all ATM and cards all the time. And she got robbed on the street a couple of times. Okay. So fast forward to today, this woman who I interviewed asked ChatGPT or one of the other AI platforms what to do to solve for that problem because her mom found a really interesting solution. It wasn't necessarily judgment, it was more like creativity, but it makes the point that there are some things that we bring to the equation that these machines never will. And so the output of the AI was, okay, invest in your security, get cameras, learn self-defense, like all these really very intelligent, operationally easy to do answers. Her mother decided that she would wear a nun's costume and she would dress as a nun coming in and out of her office so that nobody would rob her. And she never got robbed again because she understood something about human nature that like, okay, it's one thing to be sort of a pickpocket or, a guy that's kind of willing to, if you're in need of something, you'll rob somebody, but like, will you really rob a nun? Will you go so far? She understood that. So
Right.
Again, I know it's not judgment, but there is something to be said about like our capacity to understand each other and be discerning that even the most creative machines will not come up with as solutions or ways of seeing things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And especially because at the end of the day, the end users are human beings. And so even the most brilliant AI will be able to simulate it closely. And sometimes you will get overly attached to it. But at the end of the day, we understand. You hope a human understands a human in a different level. And that intuition there's something that's really valuable there. And so it is a very interesting conversation that, Anita, because I think in some ways AI is really forcing us to really think about what makes us human and what's worth, really trying to preserve and nurture further. We should be having more conversations like that. And it's a great example of, something that brings out that side of us.
So let's think about these young kids that are graduating right now. It was just grad season. We saw a lot of commencement speeches where people were mentioning AI and getting booed, right? So
Yep.
I know that you're on record saying that the problem facing youth and recent graduates isn't really a skills gap, it's an experience gap. And I'd love for you to talk about both. And I wonder if you could share whether or not you think AI is part of the problem or part of the solution.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And I do think it's both, as you say, Anita. I think it's both the skills and experience gap. And on that commencement point, I think it was interesting because I do think some of the booing of those, especially the tech, billionaires and those kind of vibe is in part just, I think, the sense that maybe even less about technology, but more how it's been the system, including how it's been regulated around this technology, has been, maybe not as thoughtful as it could be in certain parts of the world, right? And just kind of rampant, just like laissez-faire, just go and people are starting to see the real risks and concerns around, privacy or data or job loss and that kind of thing. I think those are really legitimate concerns. So I think that's where the trust piece is so important, including our rolling out of a national strategy here in Canada. Is we need to build that trust at the outset as well. So, yeah, to your question about the skills, there are definitely pieces, right? That fluency, the data literacy, because you need to understand both risks and opportunities, but then also the critical thinking pieces, the human skills that can complement, but also sales and all these other things that I think young people just need, and the COVID pandemic time didn't really get to develop as much. And then on the experience side, I think it's this catch 22, which is like, with this shrinking, a lot of entry level roles shrinking and labor force changing, employers have higher expectations, and it's a catch-22 because it said, for young people, it's like in order to get a job, you need experience. In order to get experience, you need a job. So it can get frustrating for those entering that first rung into the career ladder. And definitely AI complicates this because it will continue, has some research shown, some entry-level roles and certain functions of roles, that drafting, research, customer support, those kind of things, first pass coding. But these were kind of apprenticeships for a lot of young people of how to learn. So that whole apprenticeship model now has to be changed, right? Because how do you develop that judgment now instead of just bypassing it and giving it to AI? So that's part of the challenge. And then on the solution side, AI could help if a student with the knowing when to use AI and when not to, building the good judgment, critical thinking to then figuring out how to leverage it so they can test ideas faster, to move more quickly, um, and to apply it. And again, not in an abstract way, but really in concrete contexts. And so really thinking about real problems in the community, in an organization, and figuring out what are case studies that actually where it can make an impact. So I think that's partly what we're trying to get, try to help, is really making it concrete, because even for small businesses and startups, so we're helping on the other end. They're also just kind of figuring out, like, we hear a lot about discussion, but where do we start? How to make it more real, and young people are well positioned if they can leverage those to help support that on both. So it can be a win-win for both ends.
So interesting, because we're going to see the transition where some people are going to have relationships with AI that are going to be true cognitive partners, and others are sort of going to maybe not take the full advantage of that, and that's going to put them maybe in a disadvantage somehow. But eventually, when we've kind of like understood how that partnership could be best leveraged, there's going to be a generation that's growing up with AI just like we grew up with calculators, right? So deploying them as just sort of tools in our alongside our very human capacities, which I think is kind of interesting. Do you have any advice, Steven, about what young people should do to land their first job, given the context they're in?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think right now it is a very noisy sort of market, and in many ways, AI is being used on both ends by those who are applying for jobs and those who are filtering the jobs on the employer side. So a resume on its own might not be sufficient to stand out. So a big piece of advice I try to give is really thinking about, first of all, just the mindset, like seeing it not just as a career ladder, more like a jungle gym. And that's why the entrepreneurial mindset is all the more important, taking ownership, being CEO of your own career. The second is really trying to create kind of a portfolio of concrete things that you've done or built, so that you really can show that proof of impact, early on, because I think employers are starting to increasingly look for that. What have you done? How did you do it? So it's, whether you can do it on your own, right? Whether it's building a demo over a weekend, writing a report, volunteering for a nonprofit, interviewing folks and publishing something you learn, taking that initiative and then being able to follow through and create something. I think it can be really helpful. So you have that body of work you can show at the early stages. And then I think in terms of the quote unquote networking piece, I think it's really building genuine relationships and less asking directly for jobs and more asking for advice, context, problems. Instead of asking, are you hiring? Maybe is there a problem that your team is trying to solve that a young person like myself can help with? And that just kind of maybe shifts the conversation a bit. So, and I think lastly, in terms of using AI in the job search process, I would say just be very careful not to completely outsource so much of the thinking. I mean, it can help you sort of distill, crystallize some of the pathways and what your interests are at doing that brainstorming. But ultimately, and also maybe practicing interviews and things like that. But ultimately, the thing is really showing your human side, right? That passion, that judgment we talked about, knowing what matters, the ethical piece of it, where it's useful. I think those human pieces are all the more important to bring out in this era.
Yeah, and I certainly always underline to students that I have graduating, going into their interviews, I say, you have no idea how much a good attitude will get you far, and just make that known that you've got a good attitude, good work ethic, but a good attitude. I think that's
Goes a long way.
Goes a long way. What about like reverse mentorship? The younger generation, they're like digital, that's their world. They have AI fluency. Uh, like old people like me, that still use an agenda written on paper.
Love it.
What do you think about that possibility?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's so much potential in that. And I think, we should definitely appreciate all the things that young people can bring in those relationships. And it's their ability to, like, this instinctive feel they have for how to use some of these tools. How people are communicating in a social media context, how trust is being built in those new environments, how attention is captured now, like this attention scarcity we have, how communities are being built. So there are, I think, a lot of elements that have that sort of natural advantage. And so it is something where it's not just a gimmick where like some senior executives say like, teach me your TikTok, right? But it's a mutual journey of mentorship where younger people can bring that fluency, and then of the tools and the cultural signals, but then senior people can bring obviously their institutional history, memory, and pattern recognition, and so that magic is in that exchange, I think. So yeah, and I think so. If we can apply that to organizations more broadly, I think it'd be very transformative, pairing junior employees with those senior leaders, especially around something like what is responsible AI adoption could look like. So that's a great question. That got me thinking, like, could we more deliberately do more of those kind of pairings, throughout different institutional contexts?
Right, especially as people are having like their second careers after they retire, they still have so much to offer, but they might not be as skilled in all things digital. Yeah, I think that there's a great opportunity, and I know that there are organizations in the Netherlands that intentionally pair older people with younger people for that reverse mentorship experience. So listen, before I ask you a final question, which is going to be, is there anything we talked about today that we haven't addressed that you want to bring to my attention, or sort of share with an audience? I want to ask you, just for fun, net, when it comes to the future of work and the influence that AI is going to have on our world, our work, our relationships, are you optimistic? Are you excited? Are you, treading water gently?
Yeah, it's a bit of both, to be honest. And I think that ultimately that's a bit of what we hope from leaders is they really see the realities of how big the challenges can be, but still be hopeful, which is really hard to put like hold in one brain sometimes I find. But yeah, like, because as your guests have probably alluded to, like the range of how transformative or disruptive this technology could be is such a, so nobody knows 100%, but I could see it being very disruptive or transformative. And then at the same time, the risks and opportunities, the double-edged nature of it is also so great. But yeah, the genuine impact on whether inequality or job displacement or on our democracies in terms of misinformation, disinformation, all of that could be quite serious. So we do need a lot of both leaders who can help us think through this with a civic sense of civic mindedness in different sectors, but also citizens who have that level of understanding so they can really critically engage with this. Because when we're talking about literacy, it's not just about the technology, but really thinking about where does it make sense to be applied or not, and how should we be, all as a society interacting with it, building the relationship that's, and regulating it in a way that's healthy. And we need more conversations like once you're facilitating so that we can develop that engaged industry that's thinking about it and talking about it all the time. So
All right, so hopeful, basically, at the end of the day.
yes.
I love that. I love that. Stephen, is there anything that we have not talked about that you want to share? Maybe you have a megaphone and want to do a public announcement to
Yeah.
policymakers or citizens, or I don't know.
Right. I mean, I think it would be really interesting to really think about how are we redesigning the entire system, between sort of education into that transition into the future workforce, and that bridging piece of it, because so that those early career folks, the young people, have a real chance of being able to making that transition. Because I do worry that it's not just one organization, one university, one employer. It's a whole system that needs to reimagine. How do you rebuild that bit of that apprenticeship, if you will, or experiential learning? And I think that work integrated learning that Venture Canada is doing, or other organizations, or that entrepreneurial mindset, or how do you take those risks, invest in young people, and the broader cultural mindset shift, so that, as you said, we can take more risks and be willing to be okay with failure, and being thoughtful about how do we do regulation, those kind of things. That it's an entire approach that we need a lot of institutions work together, and for government to play a role as a catalyst as well. So I would definitely put more just focus on this area, because if not, I do worry about a whole generation that could be falling behind, and that's and that in some ways, at the heart of it, is a social contract that we've built between generations, and if we cannot renew that social contract in the same era we're living in, that could lead to much bigger problems to come.
Such an important message. And then early in the answer, I know you used the word bridging, and the thing that came to mind was like this bridge being built from one side, and you can see the other side, but it's being built in real time as we're crossing it, right? So if we do not bring more resources and engagement and intentional thinking about how to build this bridge so that it's successful, a lot of things could go wrong. But I think that's such a powerful message. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. This is a great conversation. I love the questions and your reflections on it. So yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation.
I ask all my guests, even if it doesn't matter the topic, doesn't matter the season, to sort of narrow in on the personal level of how powerful I think empathy can be in our lives. My question is, Steven, can you think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you?
Yeah, that's such a interesting question. I think probably a really memorable moment would be when you know, I first arrived in Canada um, as a kid. A lot of things felt quite unfamiliar: language, social cues, expectations. And my grade 5 elementary school teacher, Leanne, she, I think really displayed that degree of empathy. Because yeah, I was still learning English, didn't, still trying to figure out how to do schoolwork and keep up. But she and the school handed out these like most improved student award. and it was only just for a couple of people at the whole school. She's like, why is it only a couple of people? I'm going to do my own thing in the classroom. And it ended up I getting a whole bunch of them over the year, and get to walk home with this little thing and put it on my wall, just like encouraging me, like, okay, making slow progress. And I just think, she was a great example of really focusing on that empathy, in the sense of being patient before, just making a decision whether I was a good or bad student. She didn't necessarily lower the bar, but she understood the context. And I just, now in hindsight, really can appreciate what she was doing. And that was empathy, I think, in many ways, was seeing not just what I was producing, but what I was carrying and who was becoming. And that stayed with me, I think, and taught me to that empathy isn't necessarily about lowering standards, but it's widening and deepening understanding. Um, and now as a leader, I think about that often, and how people, aren't showing up. They're not showing up as blank slates. They are carrying various, invisible, unseen burdens, transitions, and struggles. And that empathy, to me, in part means recognizing the humanity before, making a judgment. And I think that's the kind of leadership that we might benefit from seeing more of in the world.
I love that story, and we love Miss Leanne. Don't we love those elementary school teachers? They're just rock
Are the
stars.
best.
Yeah, they're the best.
Absolutely.
I think you felt seen, and she provided a lot. There was a lot of perspective taking, and there was a lot of purposeful empathy in her actions. Do you still have that certificate, Stephen?
Gosh, I got that just ask my parents. We moved once or twice, so maybe they're in a basement somewhere. But I do stay in touch with Leanne to this day, so which is an incredible thing. Through social media, we been able to stay in touch, and I was able to meet up with her a couple years ago, and introduce her to my baby sister, who's also now exploring, kind of navigating her career journey, and Leanne is giving some advice. So it's been an ongoing friendship, which is great.
I love that. It's kind of like the low-key message of the entire conversation is that through social media, so through a technology, you're able to stay in touch with somebody who human to human really impacted your life, right? So it's a tool to enable us to be human. Right.
Well said. Exactly. Exactly.
All right, Stephen. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated having this conversation. Lots of more food for thought. All of us citizens should be really considering the world we're in and shaping it. So thank you all for watching and for listening, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation or found it illuminating, I hope you'll check out the other episodes from this series devoted to empathy in the age of AI. And if you know someone who would enjoy the show, I hope you'll pass it along. Before you go, please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next week.